Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. This is a very exciting episode for me, or we'll see how exciting it is in retrospect. But I've, as longtime listeners know, I've wanted certain, I call them my guys, right? I wanted a rat guy on here to talk about rat stuff, and I got that, but I needed a new rat guy. I needed a dog guy. I got a dog gal to do that. I've wanted a geoengineering guy for a really long time, and I kind of, by happenstance, bumped into this person at the Aspen Ideas Festival. He actually introduced himself to me, which was very generous. And once I realized he wasn't one of the strange people at the Aspen Ideas Festival and had actually knew things and was interesting, I started to get really engaged in it. And I warned him that I might have him on my podcast, or asked him to come on. And I told him, I was like, I've always wanted a geoengineering guy. I did not know at the time that he's kind of like the geoengineering guy, not just a geoengineering guy. We'll put his full bio in the notes, but in triumph of modesty, he just says, I should introduce David Keith as a professor at the University of Chicago in geophysical sciences. He got a physics degree from MIT. He knows Earth things. So we'll get to all of that in due course. David, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, great. So as I was saying to you before we started recording, on a play on my normal opening question for authors, and I asked them what their book is about, I thought we would just sort of start as a level setting thing, explaining terms and whatnot, and ask you, what is geoengineering?
Well, I think it really means two different things that are sometimes lumped together in what I'm now calling climate engineering. You know, in any disputed topic, people fight about the names. So I think there are really two things there, carbon removal and sunlight reflection. And you might still say, what are those things? And I think the best way to think about what those things are is in relation to the whole climate problem. So I think fundamentally, the climate problem is a four-dimensional problem. There are four things humans can do about climate. We can decarbonize the economy. That means we can keep having goods and services and getting richer, but not put carbon in the atmosphere by gradually switching to nuclear power, solar power, or what have you. The second thing we could do is we could take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. It's carbon removal, or carbon geoengineering, if you like. And that does something in the near term that's just kind of the same as cutting emissions. But in the long run, it allows humans to do something different, because it allows you to lower the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, which would actually reduce long-run climate change, which can't be done by cutting emissions. If we stop cutting emissions, we just leave the climate where it is. We don't cool it down. Then what carbon removal does is it breaks the link between the accumulated historical emissions and the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. Then solar geoengineering, or sunlight reflection, weakens the link between the actual amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at any time and the amount of climate change that we have. It doesn't break it. That is, it's not perfect anti-CO2, but it allows us to reduce the amount of climate change that humans and the environment feel for a given amount of CO2. Then the fourth thing is adaptation, which again doesn't break but weakens the link between the damages of climate, heat, changing precipitation, etc., and the actual physical amount of climate change by a bunch of local things, from building dikes to air conditioners for schools.
Okay, so just for listeners to understand, the point about taking the CO2 out of the atmosphere, that's because we've accumulated a whole bunch of it, right? And it stays in the atmosphere. It has a long lag time. It's sort of like if you fill up a bathtub, you can turn off the spigot, but if it's already pouring out, or if there's always too much in it, one of the things to do is to turn off the spigot and lower the amount of water going in. And the other thing to do is take a bucket and empty out the bathtub. And taking the CO2 out of the air is sort of like emptying out the bathtub.
Yeah, I think on a political timescale, the warming basically lasts forever. I mean, in practice, it's thousands of years, which is infinity on a political timescale. So I think a crucial thing to know is that for climate, the amount of warming this century is proportional to the cumulative emissions of carbon dioxide and these other greenhouse gases over all historical time, like starting with the Industrial Revolution. And that is completely different from some other pollutants we're used to. So air pollution right now is a bigger killer than climate, but air pollutants just last in the atmosphere for a week or so. So once you've made the changes to stop putting them in the atmosphere, then they're gone.
Okay, so before we get to the technological aspects of how one might do some of these things, I know you're in the mix of this. I've always been sympathetic to geoengineering in the sense that, and if there's or climate engineering, if that's what you prefer, because it seems to me the extent, the opposition to climate engineering seems to me to simply be psychologically and philosophically to be an extension of other quote unquote tamperings with nature throughout time, right? I mean, there was a time when people said women should feel pain in childbirth. Antibiotics are a tampering with nature. Modern surgery, modern medicine is a tampering with nature. Trying to restore habitat is, I mean, like we are down that road in all sorts of different places. So it always felt to me that forget about the technical questions, the philosophical and moral question doesn't seem very different to me. It may be infinitely more complicated and the stakes may be higher, but it's still, this is what humans have been doing with nature in various ways since the agricultural revolution. Since you have to have these fights and people pick on you about this stuff, am I wrong about that? Is there a steelman case about why this is different than other forms of sort of trying to conquer nature?
So I think there are a couple big differences. So I think there are two kind of deep concerns that people who really think that we shouldn't be talking about this or doing any of it tend to have. One is the one you referred to, meddling with nature, and the other one is a moral hazard concern. I think it is a fact that, especially for sunlight reflections, this idea of making the Earth a little more reflective to reduce the amount of warming for a given amount of CO2, sunlight reflection is inherently a short-term fix, a Band-Aid, if you like. And as a Band-Aid, it doesn't solve the underlying problem, which is the accumulation of CO2, but it reduces the risks. And Band-Aids, especially, Band-Aids when you've been badly injured, can be enormously helpful. But one of the underlying feelings is that we shouldn't do it or talk about it because it will reduce efforts to cut emissions. I believe that conclusion is nonsense, but I think that's part of the rationale that gets some people worried. The messing with nature one is interesting. Of course, people have messed with nature forever. And indeed, agriculture, in a sense, is deliberately altering nature to suit human desires, to produce these foods we want instead of what nature had. But I think in many ways, sunlight reflection or carbon removal, these climate engineering methods, are a kind of natural restoration because their intention is to reduce the amount of environmental change, not to bend the environment to our will. And so in that sense, I think they're more like things that we've done to do restoration of ecosystems after damages. So reintroducing species that have been rendered close to extinct or restoring wetlands. I think in that sense, it's deliberately altering the natural world, but altering it in a way to reduce the human footprint.
All right. So we'll come back to some of the philosophical stuff, but on the technological side, all right, walk me through it. How do we reduce, what is it, solar?
I'll call it sunlight reflection.
Right?
Yeah.
Or sunlight reflection mediation.
Yeah. So the name's been disputed. I like sunlight reflection because it directly describes in a way that feels easy to understand what the idea is, which is to reflect more sunlight. But it has been called solar radiation modification formally by the UN system. So the idea of sunlight reflection is just as it says, to make the Earth a little bit more reflective, which reduces the amount of climate change you get for a given amount of carbon dioxide. And the way that we can most be sure it would work, the way that we could, there's no doubt could be done in the sense that if there was no politics, you could get a major engineering procurement firm to go do it, is to put sulfur compounds in the stratosphere. This is sort of twice as high as a regular airplane your listeners have flown in would fly. Put these sulfur compounds in the stratosphere where they form little sulfuric acid droplets. and those reflect away sunlight. And that the basic ability to do this is not really questioned by anybody, and it's ridiculously cheap to do. So you could start doing it, gradually ramping it up from zero to add a little bit of cooling that would offset some of the warming from accumulating CO2. One could start doing it with 10 or 20 high altitude aircraft, and the cost of that is in the $1 billion category, which on the scale of the climate problem is tiny. So that's the thing that we really know about. And there, you might ask, why aerosols? Why sulfuric acid? Why the stratosphere? Putting sulfuric acid in the atmosphere seems just crazy. And the answer is that it's the devil we understand really well. So nature puts sulfuric acid in the stratosphere, both from volcanoes, which most people know about, but actually year to year from little marine plankton that releases sulfur compound that makes it in the stratosphere, and that makes the stratosphere more reflective, which cools the planet. Indeed, Jim Lovelock, this famous originator of Gaia theory, wrote in a paper in the 80s that this is one of the kind of feedback loops by which Earth is a living organism as he sees it. I think that's a little of an overstatement, but it kind of controls its own temperature. When it gets a little warmer, there's more plankton. The more plankton make more sulfur, and that cools the world down. So the idea is, in this sense, it's you could argue, I think it's an oversell to call it a nature-based solution, but it's building on a natural process that volcanoes and these plankton do. And the sulfur in the stratosphere is already there, and you're talking about increasing it. And that's kind of part of the reason why we look at it. And there's also this connection to pollution. Humans pump sulfuric acid pollutant into the lower atmosphere from mostly fossil fuel combustion. And that kills a huge number of people from air pollution, still many millions a year. I'm not making that number up. And at the peak of sulfur pollution in about 1980, it's probably somewhere around 10 million a year killed by sulfur air pollution. And so since we've regulated for air pollution, and say in the US with the Clean Air Act, but now in China and lots of other places, we've reduced sulfur emissions. Humans have reduced sulfur emissions by about half. So we were putting 70 some million tons of sulfur a year in 1980, and now about 30, low 30s, which is a huge triumph. And a lot of people's lives are saved by that. But the sulfur in the lower atmosphere is also cooling the planet. So part of the reason that warming is now accelerating, and part of the reason that we saw not much warming in the 70s and then warming began to start in the 80s is this the fact that we were cooling the atmosphere by putting sulfur in the lower atmosphere. So humans are already cooling the atmosphere by putting sulfur in, just not deliberately or not for this purpose. And here's the crucial fact. Because material lasts in the stratosphere, say 50 times longer than in the lower atmosphere, and for some other reasons, it turns out that the air pollution harm that you get from cooling the world by sulfur in the stratosphere is something like 1,000 times smaller per unit of cooling than if you do it using the current distribution of sources. So the idea is to do something we already know a lot about, which is putting sulfur in the atmosphere, which will certainly cause harms, no question. If you put, say, as people like me are talking about, 1 million tons a year of sulfur in the stratosphere, there will be harms, but there are harms that we know about in enormous detail because we've studied them for more than half a century. And they're quantitatively small compared to the benefits.
So first of all, what are the, I mean, the harms are just the air pollution harms that you're talking about.
An obvious harm is air pollution. Another one is damaging the ozone layer. And maybe a broad category of other ones is what I would call exacerbation. That is that while the goal here is to reduce climate change, and while there's no doubt that this would reduce the overall warming and reduce the overall increase in storms, it's going to, in some places, make some aspects of climate worse. I think that's kind of inevitable.
So how often do you have to deal with people bringing up Snowpiercer when you talk about
Not so
this?
much anymore. I think it's faded into history, but this has come up in fiction lots. It's the opening of Snowpiercer is a geoengineering experiment gone wildly wrong and overcooling the Earth. And there's now several novels, Termination Shock by Neil Stephenson. There's several others that have got some real traction, and it's in Ministry for the Future. So it's in a bunch of fictional treatments. And I think those fictional treatments are useful and interesting in the way they do it. I don't think the Snowpiercer one is very likely, but I think, but to answer your bigger question, what are people's deep objections? I think the deep principal objection is this moral hazard concern, not so much the runaway Snowpiercer concern, but people have a big range of concerns. I mean, Betsy Colbert wrote a book called Under a White Sky with the idea this would change the whole sky white. It won't for the amount of material that we're talking about, but it's the kind of concern that people have.
And so I remember people used to talk about just cloud seeding, creating more clouds to increase the albedo effect, which is the reflection off of the tops of clouds of sunlight and all that, right? So how is this the same thing, or is this a variation on the same idea? Just so I understand.
Cloud seeding is really the idea of making rain in specific places, and that started big time in the late 40s, early 50s, and is still used, especially in China and other places, to try and. It's always a kind of raw Peter to pay Paul phenomena because there's sort of typically only so much actual water vapor in the air or condensed water droplets in clouds, and if you make it rain one place, you typically make it rain less somewhere else. But there are reasons that we might do that. But that's very different from this idea of trying to alter the global climate. There are a bunch of other ways. I've talked about putting sulfur in the stratosphere. In principle, you could build mirrors in space, or there's ways to reduce some thin cirrus clouds, or there's ideas for making some kind of low-level marine clouds whiter. There's a bunch of ideas. But all of these ideas share the property that they are temporary fixes, that they would really reduce the climate risks. And they share the same kind of weird politics, that there's ways in which, and we'll get to this, but just to jump into it, if you believe the standard numbers about how people, especially people in hotter, poorer places, are harmed by climate, the benefits of doing this are really large compared to the harms. Benefits for development, for human lives.
So you mentioned, so when I talked to you out in Aspen, I was like, very excited I finally found someone who could confirm for me whether or not this iron fertilization of the ocean stuff is a good idea or a bad idea, and was very disappointed to find out that on net it probably is not as exciting as I thought it was. But when you're talking about the Gaia theory and the when it gets warmer, the plankton generate more sulfur, why not try to create more plankton instead of seeding the stratosphere?
So again, back to the idea that there's maybe these two categories of climate engineering. There's the carbon removal category and the sunlight reflection category. There's a whole bunch of things we can do for carbon removal. I've been involved in some. I started a company that works in one part of carbon removal. I think big picture, I'm happy to get into details, but big picture about all of carbon removal is it's inherently slow and expensive because you actually have to remove all that immense amount of carbon that the entire human fossil fuel industry has put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution. And so I think carbon removal is very important, but to my mind, carbon removal is important mostly after we've done a lot to reduce emissions. And it's a way to manage this long-term trajectory of carbon in the atmosphere. But I don't think carbon removal is very helpful for reducing the acute damages of climate in the rest of my lifetime by 2050 or afterwards. But as to how to do carbon removal, big range of ideas. Adding plankton doesn't really do much. I think the more serious ideas are actually adding alkaline materials to the ocean. Just explain that for a second. Many listeners will kind of dimly remember that acids and bases react to make salts. And CO2 is a weak acid. You probably heard of ocean acidification. And just forget us, if humans went away or we weren't there, the natural thing that would happen is the CO2, which is a weak acid, would weather alkaline rocks. That's the natural weathering cycle. And it accelerates with more CO2. And that's the natural way that the equilibrium would be restored. It is being restored just very slowly, too slowly for us. If there are a bunch of ideas of how we could accelerate that by basically grinding up alkaline rocks and putting them on soils or putting them in the ocean in a way that they will permanently remove the CO2. And I take those ideas very seriously. I think there's lots that could work there with relatively low environmental impact. But all these things, because you've got to deal with the bathtub, if you like, back in the bathtub analogy, you got to deal with it spoonful by spoonful. I think realistically, carbon removal can take a big bite out of climate change over something like a century, which I mean is not crazy. We've had electricity for a century now, roughly, but it's a long time. Whereas it's really different from the time scale of sunlight reflection, where if humans wanted to, you could begin to reduce the rate of warming quite quickly and have a significant reduction in warming compared to business as usual by 2050.
So just one last question on the stratospheric sulfur warming thing, it seems to me that one of the things that scares people about that, unlike say mirrors, right? So like you have mirrors in space and you're like, oh crap, I set the thermostat too low. You can just move the mirrors. You put the sulfur, it feels to be, I'm not saying this is
Yep.
accurate,
Yeah.
but the feeling is this is non-reversible, maybe not Snowpiercer, but like, oh crap, it triggers that sense that you get when you're trying to even out the legs on the table and you keep sawing one too much, that we might get into that kind of problem.
So what I didn't say yet is the lifetime of sulfur in stratosphere is about 2 years. So at any point, if you wait 2 years, it's gone, and there's no dispute about that. And so what the way I and many of my colleagues think about this is this would be a matter of starting to add a kind of tiny amount of sulfur each year, doing that maybe for a decade, watching very carefully what happens, and then gradually adding more, and then essentially watching the results, watching carefully the stratospheric change in stratospheric circulation and chemistry, monitoring the climate, and gradually, incrementally adjusting the dose, if you like, up and down. So you're never committed to do it forever. And this would be an interactive piece of environmental management with the hard politics that entails. And actually, back to fiction, I mean, first of all, obviously, in the next half century, the idea of building space sun shields at the scale we're talking about, I think, is not plausible. But beyond that,
it has its own problems. Yeah.
I mean, space have these amazing changes in the cost of access to space from SpaceX and other companies in the last decade. So it seems a little less crazy than it did a decade ago to talk about doing this later in the century. But a space sun shield, these ones would be at something called this Lagrange point in between the Earth and the Sun. They're dynamically unstable. So the disadvantage there is the opposite side, that a software problem or an attack could remove the thing in, well, depending on the design, day timescales. So then you get this very sudden.
All right. Well, there goes that idea. All right. So, how to get at this? So, I think climate change is real, and I think it's a real problem. And I'm glad there are people like you who are thinking about it. And at the same time, part of this is a journalistic point. Is just basically there's very little environmental coverage that isn't about climate change at this point, at least that breaks through. And I care about ocean acidification because I care about the ocean, right? I'm not saying I don't care about climate change. I'm just saying, but putting that aside, like the health of fisheries matters to me a lot. There are a lot of environmental things, species loss, rainforest, that I understand some of these things will make climate change worse. And some of these things will get worse because of climate change. I'm fine with the catalytic arguments going both ways. But are there things that if we just concentrated on the environment, that the knock-on effects would be better for climate change as well? You know, like planting a gazillion trees. I feel like there's a lot of grift and fraud in that industry, but but the idea itself, I find pretty compelling.
So let me get there first by saying that like lots of debates, it's your job, things have become absurdly polarized in this topic. So people on the kind of most aggressive climate left really are deeply committed to the idea that it's an existential threat. And, lots of people on kind of the fossil right are committed to the idea there's no problem at all, or that's completely blown out of proportion. And even though I've worked on climate change my entire career and come from a kind of old environmental family, and I'll tell you more in a second about the answer to the question you just asked, I don't buy that climate's an existential threat. I think that I think there are, when I think about real existential threats, I think about nuclear war, biological war, different ways through AI directly or mediated by AI. I think there's a real possibility for us wiping out inconceivably an entire species, or certainly like more than half of humanity pretty quickly. I mean, we have the capacity to do that with nuclear weapons, not much beyond the time length of this podcast. And I just don't think climate is like that. The fact is that climate is, to me, the worst coordinated global environmental problem, with a bunch of caveats there. But the scale of the problem is that, if we warm the Earth another degree centigrade, we really do increase death rates in hot countries and reduce economic productivity in ways that we now have good econometrics that can tell us and it's bad, but it's bad at a scale that's actually not that different from the scale of the air pollution damage I talked about. So
Mm-hmm.
if people want to claim climate's an existential risk, they have to tell me why air pollution is not an existential risk. I think these are risks that kill, millions of people, that shorten lives by of order a year. These are very serious problems worth fixing. But I don't think they quite count as existential. And on the other side, obviously, there's this kind of commitment to the idea that the problem doesn't work. And then, as often with these things, both sides kind of extremify the other.
Mm-hmm.
To come back to your question, I resonate a lot with it, although I differ in some places. I think that climate has kind of become a synonym for everything that's environmental in a way that's actually unhealthy.
Mm-hmm.
There are lots of other environmental problems that are severe, and they tend to all get pulled into climate. Partly it means that institutions or people who work on those problems need to find a climate link for them because they need to get attention. So if you're trying to do protection of wilderness areas, as I live in Alberta, Canada, and a bunch of my friends in this little town do work in Yellowstone to Yukon and these kind of large scale environmental protection work. These people now all need to kind of tell a climate story, even if it's not very relevant. And there are some places where things are aligned, as you said, where protecting the environment also helps climate, and other places where it's not aligned. And if you talk about fisheries, big problem with fisheries is mostly overfishing and fisheries management, and we need to get after that. So I think the idea that climate is kind of eaten all other environmental problems is actually kind of unhealthy, and people don't think about the trade-offs. So we absolutely must decarbonize the economy, and solar power is much better than coal, but there really are trade-offs of, say, wind power having, by spreading over the landscape and changing local climates, has real impacts that you need to think about. And the community doesn't do a good job of doing it.
Yeah, I mean, again, that's one of the reasons why I loved the iron fertilization stuff, and it's one reason I love artificial reefs and the way in the Gulf of Mexico when they're closed down an oil rig, they knock the thing over, and it's actually aesthetically it kind of offends people, but it turns out that they're actually really good for wildlife, because a lot of the ocean floor in certain places it's a wet desert, right? I mean, it's just a empty sea floor, and if you put structures up, nature is really good at creating ecosystems if you give them, the building blocks for them. And I'd love to see more of that kind of thing. And so I guess I'm kind of making my point about other people, making the same point you're making, is like, there are things I would love to see us do for the environment that are good for the environment, but I have to feel like there's some knock-on benefit for the climate problem.
So let me point to places where they might not diverge. I mean, actually, my local area here in the Rocky Mountains is a good example. So people tend to assume that keeping more carbon in forests or tree planting is sort of axiomatically good for the environment and good for climate. Good for the environment because trees are good, and good for the climate because less carbon in the atmosphere is good. But
don't young trees absorb more CO2 than
for sure?
old trees?
I mean, in equilibrium, forests don't really absorb CO2. The decay equals new supply. But if caring about the environment means caring about the ecosystem as it was in a way that's kind of unmanaged, the natural ecosystem here has a cycle of fire, and fire suppression has actually built up more biomass than is natural. And so there's places where fire suppression is actually altering the landscape in ways that is helping climate, in the sense that it's keeping some carbon out of the atmosphere, though it's an unstable equilibrium because the climate warms up and there's more fires. But it's actually not pushing the environment in a way that I would consider natural. And so, just to give maybe a more extreme example, there are people who write papers, I don't think it's serious, but you could build giant solar farms or nuclear reactors on the coasts of the deserts, big deserts, say in Saudi Arabia, Libya, wherever, and use those for giant desalination and plant huge forests run by desalination in the Sahara and take a lot of carbon out of the air. People have written a bunch of papers about this. You can argue whether it's cost effective. I kind of doubt it. But what's clear is if you care about the natural environment, that's not making the environment better if you love the desert environment any more than covering it with solar panels is.
You said about, and I was reading up on some stuff about before we started recording, and this bit about wind farms changing the local climate. What do we know about that? I mean, on the right, I have one of these things where it drives me crazy, where there are some ideas I think are very good, and then Donald Trump starts talking about them, and it makes it impossible to talk about them in a serious way. He's got, when he starts talking about windmills causing cancer,
Yeah, yeah,
and
yeah.
but they are killing birds, right? I like charismatic megafauna, so like I don't like it when
Yeah.
cool birds get killed. But what do we know about the environmental impacts and value of windmills?
Happy to get to that because I actually published one of the first papers on the environmental on the effect of wind turbines and changing climate. So I'll get to that in a second. But I do want to come
You've
back to
been
the
earning enemies for a very long time.
wacky politics
Yeah.
of climate engineering, because that's really the core of what I want to go. But yeah, I mean, I know Trump must have said something about this because Newsmax actually reached out to me and wanted me on some show about this topic in the last days, and I said no. So yeah, just my view: windmills don't cause cancer that I know about. I mean, other than some trace materials that anything causes cancer. The bird kill stuff is not so serious now. The early ones at so-called Altamont Pass in California that had perches for falcons or other birds of prey, and the perches were right where they could then fly into the spinning small turbine blades. Those were big bird killers, but that's not the kind of turbines we have now. So the larger turbines with a lower rotational rate are significantly less bad for birds. So my understanding is the bird kill situation is not particularly severe. It's not zero, but any large scale energy system has environmental impacts. It is true that wind turbines do cause climate change, and we can now observe that. So you can look at satellite data of temperatures before and after big wind turbines, and you can see warming, especially at night. It's real. But that's not a reason, in my view. It's a reason, in my view, to kind of tip the balance from wind to solar, which I think is happening because solar is getting cheap anyway.
Right.
And there's a related reason that wind turbines just sprawl over the whole world, and they generate, basically it takes about 10 times or more as much land of wind turbines as it does of solar panels to generate the same amount of power. So I think
Also,
in the
the
long
manufacturers, isn't the manufacture of them pretty carbon intensive too, and the transport of these
no,
giant
actually
blades?
pretty small.
Really?
The energy payback's really good. Yeah, yes. Again, there's difference in these early data or stuff that the right will seize on, but no, modern wind turbines are extremely high energy payback. So I'm not from like 20 to 1 or 50 to 1. I haven't looked at the latest data, but the answer is the supply chains are efficient now, and wind turbines are producing a huge amount of energy. So that's a canard, and it's a canard for solar too. But they do have an environmental impacts. And I published some of those early papers on wind turbines and climate, and that got this huge blowback. Joe Rome wrote to me as I was an evil one, and this is a sign that I think the environmental community is sometimes, as is very true in geoengineering, gets so committed to the particular political position it's in for other reasons that it's not willing to be straightforward about doing its job of speaking for environmental protection. And kind of gets lost in the politics. And I think that was a case where the environmental community really reacted against, and I think it's fair to say tried to push out this concern about wind turbines and climate, because they were sensibly fighting to build more wind power, which is a good thing, but weren't willing to take seriously the fact that there are trade-offs. And at very large scale, as we're getting to now, we have to start thinking about those trade-offs.
So trade-offs. Trade-offs are in many ways the essence of I would argue sort of the conservative approach to life, to politics, to economics, to be sure. Tom Sowell always loved to say there are no policy solutions, there are only policy trade-offs. And so one of the things that is frustrating to me as an observer of this stuff for a very long time is the degree to which I'll just do it in the macro picture, and you can take it any way you want to go. But there are a lot of people who seem to believe that if I agree with them on their diagnosis of a problem, I must therefore agree with them on their solutions to fixing it. And I'm not trying to traffic in crazy stereotypes or anything, but there are a lot of people in sort of green world who have deep-seated and sincere convictions about how economics should work, about how to think about public policy, going back to John Muir, about how environmentalism is a religion to a certain extent. And so when you say, well, why don't we do whether it's Bjorn Lomborg or Cass Sunstein or whoever, why don't we just do a cost benefit analysis of this stuff and apply sort of basic economic principles about how to fix the problem? Um, I'm perfectly happy to listen to theologians tell me that poverty is a grave sin for the society. I don't necessarily go to theologians to get the economics right to deal with this stuff. And so I guess the question I have is where do you find, as someone who's sort of getting it from all sides, you're kind of using, and I know this is a gross simplification and kind of unfair to everybody, but you're kind of using right of center means for left of center ends. And so therefore you're pissing off everybody, right? How am I thinking about this wrong? And what is wrong in your mind with bringing a cost benefit analysis to all of these questions?
Not much. We'll get to the little bit that there is maybe, but so first of all, I think there has been a huge amount of cost benefit analysis. That's what Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize for, was this fundamental cost benefit analysis of climate change. And I think sometimes people on the right just want to wish that away. So there is a cost benefit analysis. It says the real economic costs, now kind of really well confirmed through econometric data, that shows that like a hotter year, a year that's 1F, I've got the numbers memorized right, hotter in India, reduces annual growth by about 15% that year. In Sweden, it increases it by more like twice as much on the other direction, so 30%-ish. These are big changes, and there's some uncertainty, significant uncertainty about them, but the underlying fact that high temperatures in hot places reduces productivity and increases mortality, this is now very well established, and you can turn that directly into economic impacts. And I think whether you want to think purely in terms of, quality adjusted life years, or you want to think about dollars, in either case, you can do a sensible cost benefit analysis. And the answer is that cost benefit analysis unequivocally shows that action to reduce carbon emissions makes sense. So that's important to say. But what it shows is that action makes sense in what the environmental left would consider a relatively slow way. So Nordhaus' famous so-called DICE model, that was one of the things he won a Nobel Prize for, that does this cost benefit analysis, it suggests that the optimal policy would still leave temperatures 2.5 degrees or something above pre-industrial. Whereas lots of the environmental left is committed to the idea that we should keep temperatures at 1.5 centigrade, which would require, well, at this point it's more or less impossible, but would require cutting emissions extraordinarily fast. So cutting emissions in the rich world by half in sort of a decade or some time scale like that. And cutting emissions in even poor countries that are growing quite quickly. So I think two big things. Yes, we should do cost benefit analysis, and we have. And people on the right need to, if they're going to preach cost benefit analysis, they got to actually not bullshit and admit that it's there and that totally justifies real action. But people on the left also need to admit that this 1.5 target was a political target. Lots of cleverness about the political target, actually, but it's not a cost benefit target. And cutting emissions that fast is actually doesn't pass a cost benefit test. So the answer is, yeah, I do think we should do cost benefit for real. And my only caveat is I think there's some kind of big questions about how to think about the natural world overall, or how to think about the value of things beyond kind of direct human utility, which I personally care a lot about, and I think doesn't work well in cost benefit, but we can kind of leave that aside.
Oh, no, that's totally fair, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you propose to me that it would be great for the climate or the economy if we paved the national parks and turned them into industrial parks, I would oppose it for the same gitchy-goo reasons that you would, right? Just it's romantically, it's philosophically, aesthetically gross. Agree with that.
And I think, actually, I may just jump in. I think the place where the politics of solar geoengineering really is insane, on particularly on the environmental left, is if you buy any of this cost-benefit analysis, solar geoengineering looks spectacularly good, kind of as good as vaccines, sort of 1,000 to 1 good ratios. And the good comes most to people in the developing world who are in hot places. And yet, lots of the environmental left is just kind of so deeply committed to not looking there that it keeps finding excuses for avoiding that, I think, reality.
Yeah. Now, and speaking as someone who, has got his, uh, who's controversial on the right these days, for all sorts of reasons, I will comfortably put on my right-wing hat for a moment here and say that, since you brought it up earlier about the idea that climate change is an existential threat, um, I used to compile lists of, like, Bernie Sanders calling it an extinction level event and all of these kinds
Yeah.
of things. If you actually believed that were true, the things you would do to prevent it are much different than the things that Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders proposes, which is one of the things that buys a lot of skepticism from the right, is that, if you say it's an extinction level event, but under no circumstances can we have nuclear power, it's like, what are we talking about here? It's like saying, we wouldn't use nuclear weapons to take an asteroid about to hit planet Earth out if we thought it would work. You do whatever you have to do for an extinction level event, and yet they rule out prematurely or preemptively all sorts of things that are aesthetically displeasing or politically unpopular, and it undermines the efficacy of the rhetoric.
For sure, but kind of back at you, there's big blocks of the sort of normal conservative side, whatever exactly that is. I hope I'm talking to some remnant of it, who
Hence the name of the podcast.
Accept the climate science. Obviously people who just totally want to deny science on both sides, but there are people who accept the climate science, but really are kind of weirdly committed to the idea that this will all just kind of magically happen through green capitalism, or who really are just not willing to accept that the cost-benefit analysis in fact says that the level of effort in decarbonization that, say, Biden's IRA had is actually not that far off the correct cost-benefit number. Now, the way they did it is not the way I would have chosen, or my guess is you would have chosen. Through a whole bunch of subsidies, I would have much preferred it to be pricing, or a lot of ways it could have been better. But you can't blame that all on Biden. There's lots of ways that was the only plausible way to get that through Congress at this time. And I think what I am not seeing on the kind of conservative remnant mainstream is kind of a credible climate policy from their point of view. What would a real climate policy look like that took market seriously, that took the cost benefit test seriously, that wasn't trying to like ban people from gas stoves right away, but was actually trying to cost effectively begin the long, slow process of cutting emissions. And you just don't hear that.
Yeah, I mean, my one of my oldest friends is Ron Bailey. He's the science correspondent at Reason, and he's been for carbon taxes. And I mean, I those people exist, but like,
sure,
I don't know if you've noticed this from your lofty perch in Canada. This is not a time of serious public policy debate in the United States of America. And the right has a lot of problems with it. Does not shock me that you're frustrated that you can't find a lot of people on the right willing to have a serious conversation about this. But I brought up the cost benefit thing in part because I'm philosophically fairly committed to the idea that things get easier as societies get richer. And as a fraction of GDP, some of the things, the wind and solar stuff is much more affordable now than it would have been 40 years ago, right? And I think that people sometimes think that getting richer is on a separate track from technological advance, but really they're kind of the same thing, just seen from it's sort of like, it's a particle, no, it's a wave. Oh, getting more productive or getting richer, they're kind of the same thing. And this is why I'm very sympathetic, or one of the reasons why I'm very sympathetic to the sort of these mitigation things that allow society to get richer, to figure out stuff to get us to that point. Like if we knew we could have cold fusion in 20 years, but it's really, really unaffordable, it seems to me, pump a bunch of sulfur into the stratosphere and rush like crazy to build cold fusion. And even if you have to burn a lot of fossil fuel to do it.
The big thing now is so different from a decade ago, is that we are doing it. So just to put the numbers out there, last year the world spent about $2 trillion on clean energy. That's Bloomberg NEF, New Energy Finance's number. People don't contest that number that much. That's roughly 2% of world GDP. Lots of that money is pissed away on stupid things, but lots of it's spent pretty seriously. And the big change is that solar now is cheap enough that you really can imagine decarbonizing most of the way on solar without any technological breakthrough. And that's, I say that, I should say, in a kind of some man bites dog, because I wrote papers that showed that the solar learning curve was flattening. I was skeptical. I love solar, but I thought it wasn't going to work. And I was wrong. And I think solar is now cheap enough. People may just not grasp the scale of how cheap and how big it is. The biggest last year solar installation I'm aware of was a 5 gigawatt installation in Western China, done at 60 cents an installed watt at the AC line. That's just unbelievable. And it's not going to stop. And obviously, cheap solar doesn't magically decarbonize anything. You can't run an airplane on cheap solar. There are lots of issues about long distance transmission and batteries, but in a way that feels really different than when I was having this conversation 20 years ago. It feels like, yeah, if we had cold fusion, that'd be great. But and I do think that building out nuclear power, as the Chinese are now doing more seriously, would be good. But there's a way in which it's not necessary to make enormous progress in decarbonization because solar really is there. And that's just a different world. And I think now it makes it easier to just have a policy to drive there.
So all of my adult life, people have been talking about peak oil, minutes away from peak oil. I was looking at the numbers before we started. Global use of fossil fuels as a share of energy consumption. Really, I mean, it hovers in this range around 81%, going back 3-4 decades. United States, a little higher, like 83, 84%, something like that, with some jot and tittles. Given how we've added so much alternative energy sources to the grid in the last 15 years, it's really just absorbing only extra demand. But are you saying that we're going to start to actually see the fossil fuel number appreciably decline in the next 10, 20 years?
That'd be my guess. But, predicting the future is hard. But that's my guess. And that's what a lot of mainstream forecasters, not just enviros, but like serious forecasters now suggest. It's conceivable that peak global CO2 emissions are kind of this year or next. I think it'll be a bumpy peak. I think it's going to be a flat plateau for some years. But, if you look at, so you said fossil, that's obviously a measure, but we've shifted coal and gas. So if we say CO2, US emissions are now quite a long way down from their peak. European emissions are a long way down from their peak. Chinese emissions are down now year on year a little bit. It's quite possible that Chinese peak is now. Obviously, Nigeria and India are going up and should be going up because of their huge poor populations. And the question is kind of the saw off between those. But there is a lot of evidence that the plateau is kind of about now. At least by one data set I looked at, cement is peaked. That's begun to decline. But then somebody else I trust had another view. So I think there's uncertainty in this. But I think it's reasonable to think that
what does that mean?
Meaning emissions from cement production have begun to decline globally.
Okay.
Which would be because China's kind of like, its population is obviously now not growing, and they've kind of built out their cities, and so they're declining. And again, Europe and North America are pretty flat, and then India, Nigeria, et cetera, are going up, but not fast enough. So bottom line is, I think it is quite reasonable to imagine that CO2 emissions never go beyond a few percent higher than they are now, and we have this kind of bumpy peak and then the beginning of a slow decline. And that we're basically there. So it's complicated. What you said is true, that the fraction of primary power from fossil hasn't moved much. On the other hand, these build-outs have been going so exponentially. So it's really, solar went from being kind of small to huge in really just a few years. And electric vehicles are also now moving, again, faster than I expected. Like, really stunning, and this is where it's easy to get too buried in U.S. politics. I got both citizenships, by the way, and I work at UChicago, and I don't know, you can even argue that this is a good time for U.S. policy discussion in the sense that at least everything's kind of wildly on the table in a way that it wasn't before.
That's fair.
But the U.S. is still only whatever it is, 20-some% of the global economy and of emissions, and whatever Trump is doing is important, but it's not determinative. And I think some of these big decarbonization plays are still happening. The Economist had a nice leader this week or last week about how lots of major corporations who used to over tout their green accomplishments because it made them look good, now hide the same accomplishments, but they're still making the investments.
Mm-hmm. I know we're running up on time here, but so I actually asked a friend of mine, I will not get him in trouble, but he wanted me to ask you. He said nice things about you. I'll tell you off the air who he was. And he said, I'd want to know his views of the risk of private actors unilaterally attempting geoengineering experiments. E.g., Peter Thiel became worried. If Peter Thiel became worried about climate change, why wouldn't he order geoengineering experiments from his seasteading outposts? And also, how do you explain to like normies the difference between high risk and low risk in some of these things? I mean, like the point that the sulfur coming out after 2 years is helpful.
So I think that the central way I try and explain to normies the reason why we have some confidence that the kind of moderate sunlight reflection was sulfuric acid that INRs are talking about, that we can be confident that there aren't giant unknown unknowns or that the risks are pretty small, is this ratios with stuff that's happened. So a central place I start, as I say, we're talking about putting 1 million or 2 tons a year of sulfur that would cool the world 0.5 degree C and save kind of 250,000 lives. Say that. And then say, what is 1 million tons? So then I give them 2 numbers. One number is that the Pinatubo eruption in 1992 was 8 million. So we're talking about something like a quarter of that. So we've observed the stratosphere be hit by a big lump of sulfur, and there were some impacts. But the point is, we saw a much bigger amount of sulfur. And you don't have to trust models or complexity. This is something we observe directly, and we're talking about significantly less than that. And once the sulfur gets to the lower atmosphere, it's just sulfur with all the harms it has. But again, in 1980, we were putting 70 million tons in, and we're talking about adding 1 or 2 million. And so there's a way in which that should give a lot of reassurance. I mean, obviously, I said this quickly, but I think if you take your time through that, that says this isn't all about complicated models. Now, with those numbers in mind, this idea about experiments, I was one of the leaders of something called the Stratosphere Controlled Perturbation Experiment that got headlines in the Guardian. Bill Gates is blocking out the sun, and it was eventually canceled. And our experiment would have added something like 1 kilogram of sulfur to the stratosphere, which is the same as a regular airplane that you or I would fly in, going say to London, emits in 1 minute. So nobody who was serious thought those experiments posed a physical risk. They were opposed because people don't like this entire idea and want to block it, which they've got a right to do, but I think they're wrong. But there's not a physical risk. So I think the answer to your friend's question about Peter Thiel doing physical experiments is, I don't think there's a physical risk of experiments. There's the kind of experiments we're talking about are all tiny risk compared to normal activities of normal life, like flying airplanes. But they may have intellectual worries. More broadly, to sort of riff on that, I think there's a very weird situation in the Trump administration where there's 2 completely different attitudes toward this sunlight reflection geoengineering, and which one wins is an interesting question. So there's the conspiracy theory that says it's already happening by so-called chemtrails. And Marjorie Taylor Greene and RFK Jr. and Lee Zeldin have all recently tweeted or made statements about that. And so if that element of Trump land were in charge, they might ban all geoengineering on this conspiracy theory that's already happening. Whereas if the Thielian, going with your name, the sort of Thielian end of Trump land were in charge, they might say, let's just go ahead and do it. And I think both outcomes would be bad right away.
Let's just say, we can keep Peter Thiel out of it, but let's just say a billionaire with access to some rockets did, like, this is one of the things I try to explain to a lot of people, is that billionaires, whether of the left or the right, tend not to actually be James Bond villains, right? And they may be wrong, and they may have views I really despise, but like this sort of Dr. Evil thing is not too common. But let's just say there was a multi-billionaire who did an experiment, and based upon your experience of the horrible press you got when you did this very minor thing, said, let's not tell anybody. Is it obvious that we would know?
If it's a tiny experiment, no. But on the other hand, you don't really need to know. The tiny experiments really are tiny. I mean, emitting a kilogram or 100 kilograms of sulfur is just not a measurable risk when that's like what a regular flight does. So I think if you're talking about experiments, the answer is yes, it easily could be hidden, and there may now be incentives to do that, or certainly to do it outside the US. But I think the answer is if it's just experiments, who cares? Because they're not.
And what if it's not experiments? What if, I mean, you said it would be in the low billions to do the thing that you're talking about.
So I think the answer to that is really no. And here's why. It's about things kind of becoming de facto state actions. So I don't know, to pick up a Canada US one, let's say you're a Canadian billionaire, maybe Jim Balsillie, just because he's a bit of an oddball, and you decide you want to buy some tanks and invade the US. So you buy these tanks and you start rolling your tanks across the US border, and the US Defense Department will call up the Canadian Defense Department and say, hey, what about these tanks? You got to stop. And the Canadian Defense Department's first answer might be, well, these aren't ours. This is Jim Balsillie. He's free to do what he wants. And the US Department will say, we consider this a Canadian state action, deal with it. And then it instantly is. And I think the same thing is true with the billionaire for this. So yeah, in principle, some billionaire could build the airplanes and start flying them, but other states will instantly say, we consider this a state action. It's happening from your territory, own it. And so I think there's a way in which billionaires influence our politics, including on this topic. I've been funded by a bunch of billionaires, no question, but I don't think, and that's real, and they influence our politics in lots of ways, good and bad, and I wish there was less of it. But I don't see it as being believable that a billionaire could actually push through and implement solar geoengineering in a way that was kind of disconnected from politics. Because in the end, militaries and police forces do rule the world with all the problems that entails, and billionaires aren't just free to do whatever they want.
Right, but could they get away with it without us noticing it until
No. Deployment requires a supply chain that in this era of open. Yeah, sir, I didn't say that. Experiments are easy to hide because they're tiny, but deployment requires, even quite small deployment, a supply chain that, given the current amazing ability of open source intelligence, as we see in the Ukraine war, is just unhideable. So deployment required a minimum, let's say 10 or 20 aircraft flying all the time from an airfield with a supply chain of materials, and all of that is essentially unhideable in today's world. So a billionaire might pay money to influence the policies of some smaller, weaker government and get them to do that. That's a totally believable thing. This happens in lots of ways. But the idea that a billionaire kind of does it on a private island that is invisible, I think, is not possible anymore, given the quality of open source intelligence.
All right. So just to close out here, let's just say, for the sake of argument, you're put in charge and you get a wish list. It doesn't even have to be for fighting climate change, but I understand that, like, you have some well-developed views about doing that. What are the, if you could tell Congress, if you could tell President Trump, if you could tell whoever, these are the things that I really think we should pursue. These 3 things, 5 things, you take your pick, that have the most ROI for things that everybody claims to care about. Like, what's your dream list?
So in terms of money flow and political capital flow, would really all be on decarbonizing the economy. And I would do it in a way that was just focusing, the Willie Sutton rule, you rob the banks because that's where the money is. You focus on the cheapest places for large-scale decarbonization, which is some big additions to the grid to allow a longer distance grid transmission, which is technically easy. It just requires political force. But if you're saying I've got the political force, then that's what we would advise. Basically carbon taxes or something that looks a lot like carbon levies to start to really continue to accelerate decarbonization, not to cut emissions in half in 10 years, not the kind of what I consider the sort of extreme policies of the environmental left, but in a way that was serious. And I think that's, so a bunch of those policies, maybe give you some sort of specifics, not some of the stuff that I consider a bit green bling, which is like added incentives for some very niche-y solar panel on individual residential homes, but big incentives for continuing wind and solar build-ups, for trying to restart nuclear in the US, for carbon capture and storage on cement plants, for example. A bunch of stuff like that, which could, I said incentives, but actually I prefer to do it by just cap and trade like regulations. So that's what I would advocate there. And for sunlight reflection, I would advocate with international partners, not some universal single global agreement, but with some other countries, nudging towards beginning to do it at a very low level, because doing it at a low level has extremely low risks and also low benefits, but it teaches us an enormous amount. So my view, and I wrote this up with Wake Smith in Technology Review a year or so ago, would be start with something that would be about as much as the background amount of sulfur that these bacteria, these algae put in the stratosphere. And that would take about 10 aircraft-ish. And you do that for half a decade or a decade while you put a bunch of science into observing what happens in the stratosphere. But this is an experiment. This is really the beginning of slow deployment. And I would advocate that because I think that evidence that the benefits are big, especially for some of the world's most vulnerable, are really big compared to the harms, are really strong. But that's a tiny amount of money, to be clear. The money, the effort will go mostly decarbonization. And the other thing I've worked on, and maybe there's some credibility from a dog biting the man point of view, I did start a company that does direct air capture, carbon removal, and made money out of it. I'm excited about that. I think in the long run, carbon removal is very important, but I would not allocate a lot of money to actually implementing large-scale carbon removal now, because I think the focus should still be on decarbonization. I think we should be trying carbon removal to try and understand what the costs are, what actually works and not, because I don't believe academics. You actually got to build stuff and measure environmental impacts and costs. That's the only way you really know. I think we should do that, but more in a learning stage while we're actually decarbonizing.
I could go a bunch of different other directions, but I promise to be mindful of your time. So I hope you'll come back. I would love to talk to you more about this stuff.
I'd be happy to. I mean, the politics are really interesting. And I think that's why I'm particularly excited to talk to you, because this topic cuts right and left in a way that's different. And that's, I think, part of the way it's fun. So there are people on the right who are quite supportive of climate engineering and people on the left who hate it, and also vice versa. But it's just different. And so, yeah, I'd love to talk more about it. Lots to happen.
Yeah, I just philosophically, I have zero problem with it. For me, it's all practical. Like, I want to really make sure it works. I like your approach. Start small, measure twice, measure 3 times, cut once, kind of thing. But if you believe that it's a long-term climate change is a long-term problem, buying us time to make everything cheaper to fix it is intuitively makes an enormous amount of sense to me. And I just think it's most of the objections to it boil down to the ick factor for people. And if you can and the number of boons to mankind that were delayed or denied because of the ick factor is enormous. And so to me, it's not a particularly ideological thing. It's really a public policy thing.
One way that I sometimes say it is, you can imagine a kind of 2x2 matrix where solar geoengineering or sunlight reflection either works or it doesn't. And on one axis, and the other axis is you think it works or it doesn't. So what everybody's worried about is this worst case where we think it works and it doesn't. And that's legitimate. You know, we're kind of overconfident in it and there's some big backfire that doesn't work. It's sensible to worry about that. But people forget the other quadrant, that we might look back in 2050 having not done it because of a bunch of kind of ick factor and prejudicial politics, and realize that we missed the opportunity to save a lot of the environment and save a lot of lives. And so this idea that it might actually work perfectly, it's never going to work perfectly, but work pretty darn well, and that prejudice blocked us from doing it is I think, a real possibility. And I think in thinking about it, people need to understand and question their own overconfidence. If they're really sure we're in one quadrant, ask themselves just how sure that we're not in the other quadrant. And I think that's, to me, some of the core reason is the kind of political elite on climate have, and I'm happy to talk more about this another time, in pretty clear ways tried to kind of suppress or push off even the assessment of these technologies. And I think that's coming to an end. I think that countries that are not US or Western Europe, India or China, are taking these things more seriously. In the end, the world power is pretty diffuse in the world. But I think this business that we really have before blocked life-saving useful technologies by prejudice is something that we need to take seriously. When we think about this topic, including the genuine risk that it brings.
Okay. David Keith, thank you so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll have you back. I'm very curious to see what the listener feedback will be on this one. And thanks again.
Thanks a whole lot. Thanks for what you're doing.